what we haven't done this morning is kind of go through the beginning and the end of like the whole process of what it is to be an associate. So I know you brought some stuff to the table to show us and take us through the timeline of a project. All of which you've just put, by the way, for everyone at home, you just put all that stuff in the Dropbox in the Monday folder under guest Rob Casey. So it's all there if you want to look at it. Obviously, we realize screen sharing isn't the best on this program, but cool. If you're, yeah. I'll bow out now, Rob.
All right.
But yeah, see you in a bit.
See you in a bit. So yeah, I was going to talk about Hugh Jackman as the sort of, or actually before we do that, let's just see if anyone has any questions about what Tim and I just spoke about, anything that we've said about how I started or the various things that we may have mentioned that people just wanted clarity on. If you don't, jump in now. If you don't, we'll just carry on. That looks good. So in the guest folder under my name, I've just put a couple of attachments and a YouTube link for Hugh Jackman, which is the show that I did with Patrick last year, which was an arena show that was sort of a hybrid. It was an arena show in the sense that it was only going to be in arenas over 18,000 people, but Hugh wanted it to be very theatrical, and Hugh said that he brought Patrick on board because Patrick had lit a show that Hugh Jackman did on Broadway about 10 years ago. There was a sort of similar one-man show. And so he brought Patrick on board, but did say he wanted to make it quite theatrical. And so, which is, so Patrick self-admittedly would say that's sort of slightly out of his comfort zone. So he said, would I like to come on board? This time I've sort of only ever done traditional theatre shows for Patrick, and this would be the first thing that I had done that was over and above something behind a proscenium. The YouTube link, by the way, isn't just in a text file because I wasn't clever enough to do it any other way. Sorry, Trent. So yeah, because it's the first show I'd done that for him that was sort of not in a proscenium. It was a bit of another new challenge. But so I sort of took Chris with me again, who programmed Bat Out of Hell, and which is also another. Chris does the Strictly tour every year, which is an arena show. But other than that, would say himself that he thinks that his comfort zone is theatre. So we were sort of two people that were very theatre. One person's very rock and roll, trying to all come together to make a show that was trying to do both, which was a challenge because I had lots to learn, and but Patrick sort of put his trust in us that we would create a theatrical looking show, and he would guide us through the arena bits of it that we didn't know, which he did very well. There's the YouTube link for people. I thought it might just give a bit of context to what you're about to see in terms of the attachments. That's the YouTube link, by the way, is the opening number of the show. So it started with a schedule that came out from production. It's worth saying that the way that a rock and roll show, and let's call this a rock and roll show for the purpose of the conversation, because it sort of is in the way it was set up, compared to a theatre show, is very different in terms of the structure of the departments and how everybody works together. So I won't go into it in too much detail because it just doesn't apply to theatre, but there is still a production manager as you would have in theatre, and they have a much more senior role in an arena tour than they would do in a theatre production. Let's not deny a production manager's role in the theatre is still very high up the food chain, but in the arena world, they are significantly higher up the food chain. So we got given this schedule, which was that they were going to rehearse in Wakefield, which, for those who don't know, is in the middle of the UK. It's in a facility called LS Live, which is in a production park, which is a sort of big collection of, it's just an industrial estate. Let's not glamorize it. It's just an industrial estate in the middle of Wakefield, but it does have lots of theatrical suppliers in it. So brilliant stages are there, and who now I think are now owned by Tate. But most of the sort of big arena shows that come out of the UK, that are built in the UK, I'd say probably 60 to 70% of them are built by Brilliant. Built by Tate, which are now there. So they decided they were going to put a massive aircraft hangar next to it and turn it into a rehearsal space, which is good because you can build the set and then just wheel it across the car park. It also is cheaper than rehearsing a show in London. Let's not pretend it's for any other reason than that. But we did, so we all got shipped up to Wakefield to rehearse this show. Prior to that, after the schedule came out, I looked at it with Patrick, and we sort of looked at how quickly it's got to move and how quickly we had to put the show together, because that dictated the sort of scale of show that we're going to put together. We know that the show has an allotted budget for lighting a week, which I think was something like 32 or 35,000 or something like that, which sounds a lot of money, but it's a different ballpark figure in theatre than it is to rock and roll, and also you get your crew for that. So it's quite hard to ever compare the two together. But we know that we had that much money, which Patrick knew way better than I did what that means in terms of quantity of lights. And we also knew it meant we had 4 Neg Earth, or 4 whoever crew, whether it was Neg or PRG. And then you collect like 100 and something locals in each venue. But we knew that we had a team of 4 for lighting, and that was going to be someone on dimmers, a crew chief, someone on follow spots, which I'll get to shortly, and networking. So we decided then a couple of things quite early on, that we wanted to be relatively radical for no other reason than we actually wanted to test it for a project we were doing later in the year. We wanted to use ZACTRAC, which is for those who don't know, is like Black Tracks. It's usually a different technology, but it basically does the same thing. You put a tag on a performer, it follows that performer. The light, you then tell which moving lights to talk to which tag. Those moving lights then follow that performer around. For those who watch the YouTube link from the beginning of the number, he is completely tagged in that number, which we use that phrase by meaning that there was no human being spotting the Hugh Jackman for the whole of that number, which was, apart from Kaiser Chiefs, was relatively unprecedented in the arena world because it's such a vast scale of thing to do. But we knew that we wanted to use the technology when Patrick, Chris and I were all doing Mamma Mia the Party at the O2 later in the year. That was going to be much more complicated, using many more performers in a much more intricate space. But we knew that we sort of had to use some sort of technology for that. And we were quite excited about doing it in an arena for Hugh, so we put it on Hugh. So that we made that decision very early on, and that also influenced then the personnel, because it meant that the person doing follow spots then suddenly didn't have to call follow spots because there's nothing to call. So, but that person's role then quickly mutated into being the ZACTRAC engineer and tagging performers and taking them off and recharging the batteries, which is a job in itself. But we still knew we had 4, and that dictated how many lights we had. And so the schedule, weirdly, more than anything else at the beginning of the process, for Patrick, I suppose more than I, he could tell what size of show that we could make with it, because he knew, for example, that if you look at the 13th of May, we're playing in Hamburg that night. On the 14th of May, we're playing in Berlin, which means that the whole show needs to load out into trailers that evening and be loaded in the next morning and then be relit in that arena for the slightly different positions that exist. And after they've built the set, and then you to open the doors at 7:30 and do a show, which then you could sort of then know how many trusses you can put in the air. and how many fixtures you can put on those. So that was weirdly the first stage in the design process, which feels very uncreative, I realise, but it sort of sets out a word that you'll probably hear a lot of people say over this week, which is parameters. It set the parameters for what we could achieve as a design collective on the show. So the next thing we got, which is the second attachment, is the set designers, by the way, were Stewfish. Stewfish are entertainment architects, is how they refer to themselves. It's because they almost all of them studied architecture. It was started by Mark Fisher, who sadly passed away, but is now run by his team in the studio in King's Cross, and they are fantastic. They design theatre shows, arena shows. They design theatres themselves. They design installations. They are a huge, huge design house. They were designing HUGH, and this is the first PDF that we got from them, which is after long. Let's not pretend this was after long conversations between HUGH and the director Warren and Ray, who was looking after it from Stewfish's point of view. And so you can see from the PDF, they all drew, by the way, if anyone wants to know or cares, it's drawn in Rhino 3D, which is why the renders are so good in comparison to what you may see in other programs. But they knew that quite early on that they wanted this sort of cube structure with two big iMag screens at the side. iMag is, if I say anything that anyone thinks that I don't know what he's just said, just write it in the chat and I'll try and remember to not be so specific. iMag are screens that link back the live feed that that the cameras are showing back to the audience. So the people in row ZZZ at the O2 can still see Hugh Jackman's face. And we decided that we thought that all of these cubes would be video tiles. There'd be the two big iMag walls, and then there would be a custom circular video screen in the middle. Set of stairs going down the middle, a main stage with a slight riser for the orchestra, a big catwalk, and a B stage. That was Hugh's remit early on. He wanted a B stage because he wanted to be as close to as many people as he could, because in effect it was a one-man show. So that's what we got from Stewfish. And Patrick and I were I think we were in Toronto doing another show, and we sort of sat down for a couple of hours and started to sketch over it, what we thought we should do in terms of positions. So if you scroll down the PDF to page 8 and page 10, for example, you can see a fairly low-tech version of a render, which is drawn with an iPad pencil over what they've done, which is our sort of, maybe we should put lights here. And so I think Patrick said, if you look at page 10, for example, Patrick said, we want to follow the arc of the stage, and we want a big backlight bar. We want a bar above each iMag screen, which is a sort of very trademark Patrick Woodruff thing to do. And then we should have a truss that follows the catwalk and a front light truss for the main stage. And then I said, we should put another truss in the middle, because otherwise it's all just going to be backlight and front light, and it's going to be pretty dead on the dancers. So we sort of agreed to compromise on what ended up that drawing, which I realized when you see, especially when you see the paperwork, that's going to either come out of, Tim is a very good example of this, but also Ryan and Tim Reed, all of the American associates produce paperwork that is immaculate. And needless to say, this whole show that played to 30,000 people was done in a cafe in Toronto with an iPad pencil on thick and just drawing trusses. But that was our sort of starting point. And we went, and then we sent that back to the drafting studio, which Patrick has a full-time drafts person, which is why we can afford to not be so specific with our initial sketches, I suppose. She's called Miriam, and who's fantastic, and she works in the UK. And so we sent that back to Miriam, who then drafted that up into a proper technical drawing that we could then start to scribble some lights on. Then in the meantime, I think it was probably over Christmas. I think it must have been over Christmas. There was a sort of big pause, and we got, ignore the dates on the front of the concept stage design document. I know it says earlier than the previous one, but it's not. We got a a better, as you can see, because it's got very good renders in it, a better render of what they wanted to do with the show, which suddenly included a big arc of lights. Like if you look on page 5, there's a massive arc of lights that Stu Fisher just decided it would be a nice thing to look at. We decided it wouldn't, so we took them off of the drawing. But which is why you'll see, I think on page 3, we just scribbled them out in black, so you can't see them anymore. But we that's the aesthetic that Stu Fisher presented to Hugh and Hugh's team, and that's the one we were moving forwards with. So there were a couple of additions that they put in that we then had to react to. You'll notice they put little lights on, if you look on page 5, I think, yeah, page 5. In between each of those cubes, there's currently just a glow on this render, but clearly a light of some sort. So that was the next thing that we knew that we needed to add to it's the first thing we knew we needed to add to the list, because it's the creative that's been sold to the client. It becomes very formal when you're doing a rock and roll and arena show, and that everyone's being referred to as a client, or because it's design houses and much less personal. There's nothing negative about that, because that's just how it has to happen, because it's such a huge machine. But it becomes slightly less personal than theatre. But because Stu Fisher presented this to the client, being Hugh and his team, and they'd approved it, it would be pretty bad form for us to turn up and not have any lights in between those squares. So we took the executive decision to take the row of lights out, because we said it was logistically tough, which is true. But the lights on the squares, we confidently said would be fine. So that was sort of the next stage of the set design that came in, and that we knew that we needed to react to. And then the next thing that happened was a proposed plan, which is, I think, document 4, which is another iPad sketch. This was done by me. I think I'd spoken to Patrick on the phone about what sort of lights he wanted to use, and he didn't really care what the lights were. He just said we needed some profile backlights, some wash light top lights, and a smattering of profiles everywhere else, I think was his words, or something like that. And so I did this as a sort of first attempt. We had done a lot of shootouts previously for a couple of shows that either Chris and I were doing, or Patrick and I were doing, or Patrick and I were doing. We sort of, in this Venn diagram, we managed to shoot out an enormous amount of lights just prior to doing this plan. So we went for things that we had just seen, and we also went for things which is slightly naughty, but is, I'm afraid, what happens. We went for things that we knew that the vendor that we wanted to provide it had on the shelf, because it means that they're going to come in with a lower price, which means they're going to get the show, which means that it goes their way. That doesn't, I realise now, sounds like we've just done someone out of business. It's sort of not really true, because actually, if it went to Neg Earth in the end, which is who we sort of wanted it to go to. But if PRG had rang up and said, "Oh, those Ayrton Camsons, could they actually be more clay packy seniors Unicos?" we would have said yes if the price was lower. But it just happened to be that we knew that Neg Earth had some Unicos on the shelf. They wanted to invest in some Camsons, and they wanted to invest in some K25s. So we put those on the list, and I did this as a first version of the design, which you'll hear from throughout the week. People will say about the design process, how they as an associate see the designer do it, or they help the designer do it. And lots of designers, Paulie's included in this, and in fact everyone I work with does this, where they go through the storyboard of the show and then work out what it needs to look like, and therefore work out where the lights need to go, and then what the lights need to be, and then's a plan. Because there isn't a storyboard of an arena show. It's just that he's going to come on and then he's going to sing a song. And at this point, we don't have a script, which is also fair to say. In a commercial musical, there's a good chance you're designing the show without a script. If it's a new show, you might just be designing a show with a first version of a script and a set design. But we really had no script for this. So it's Patrick's instinct about what's going to look good, combined with Chris and I's instinct about what we genuinely need to light the show in terms of some face light and lots of backlight, and what we can then do to be clever with ZackTrack to use the lights that we've got to make it some effective looking looks out of it. So that was the next stage that we went through, which was me just drawing over a plan. And I think Patrick moved some things around, but in the end agreed to most of it. The things on the side, by the way, are ladders. There were 2 of them. I don't know why there's any one on this drawing, but there are 2. And then that plan gets sent over back to Miriam. She draws it up. So if you open the next PDF, PDF 5, you'll notice it now looks like much more like a lighting plot. That's because Miriam drew it up with real lights in it rather than just X's. And then she sends it back to me, and then I channel it. That's a thing that I said I wanted to do because I still like referring to channel numbers. Patrick will still point up and just say, "Can we have that row of lights on?" And I will generally be like, "Can we have 101 through 110 on?" And I channel most. When I worked with Paulie, I channeled all of my plans, and that was for a slightly different reason. We ended up having that we needed. There were so many shows on the road at the time that we needed some sort of uniformity. So I channeled it that they would be the same channels for the same in the same areas of the whatever show you were in, so you knew where you were on the stage. Anyway, that's an aside. I channeled Patrick's plan like this so that Chris and I could make some sense of it and use it in what we needed to do. Recall it in a way that you're going to want to recall it. And then that gets sent back to Miriam, who then draws it up with real channel numbers in Auto. They draw all their plans in AutoCAD, by the way. She then rechanneled the plan as a proper thing. So you'll see on page 2, this is a package. Patrick Woodruff Bassett Design rather create a thing for every show rather than a plot and a light right and instrument schedule and any other paperwork. They create a whole thing that they refer to as their package. This was the HUGH package, which comes out in their own way with the information that you need, which is a sort of Excel spreadsheet at the beginning of how many of each light you've got. So you'll see there were 199 moving lights made up of various different forms, a bunch of tape, the ZackTracks, and a desk. Then the next page is the main overhead plot rather. The next page is the floor plot. So you can see on the floor we had some lights at the back, light at the top of the stairs, and then because there was no side light positions, which was tricky because it was a show that we knew was going to have dancers. It was HUGH plus 8 dancers. And so we knew we needed to get side lighting in some way, somehow. So that was the only way to do it, was to put it on the floor. And Patrick was really reticent about us doing it because he said, in his experience, as soon as you turn them on, you're going to be blinding quite a significant portion of the audience because they all sit around the sides in an arena up until the point where they're facing like 2/3 of the way upstage. So if you turn the side light on, suddenly everyone in that block can't see a thing. So we did end up cutting 2 of the units out of the 12, but we did use them as much as we could and just tried to bury the light in the video walls because it was the only way of successfully lighting all those dancers. Then you'll see on that same page there are a lot of little pink squares going down the runway. That's quite a Patrick thing to do, which is have an enormous amount of floor lights just doing this, pointing straight up into your eyes. Because A, it's a good get out of jail free card for doing face light quickly. It also really helps with the cameras, which I'll get into later, but you sort of light the show with your eyes, and then you have a whole nother thing where you got to light the show for the cameras because 85% of the audience are watching on a screen through a camera, and the camera sees differently to what we see. So you then have to light it again. And the eye whites, which are the floor lights, help with that. And then on the next page, you'll see the channels for the little lights that we ended up putting on the front, in between the squares, which were Roby lead beam 150s, which were actually it was either going to be those or an X4S. These were much punchier. and they did a really good job. It did take about 48 hours of my life just on the phone. It was built by Solartech, who are in Canada, creating a bracket that we could put on that in between each square, so that when it was built, the show has to be built in less than an hour and a half to get it up and for a show that night. So those lights couldn't travel on, so they had to all come off for transit and then go onto a custom bracket. So me trying to explain to some metal fabricators in Canada exactly what they needed to do in order to get the light on it and off of it quickly, but it be secure and not wobble around. So the role of the associate on this production went from drawing some lights on the plan with an iPad pencil to help design a custom bit of metalwork to put a light on a square. It's needless to say, it was quite a breadth of a job. And then the final document you'll see is all the tape, which actually ended up being pixel tape in between the squares, because at the last minute, Patrick thought that we needed one other sort of trick up our sleeves. And I said, I think the easiest way to do it is to say that we don't want LED tape, we just want pixel tape, because then you've got a shed loads more you can do with it. And then all the stuff around the edges, because of the curvature, became floppy flex, which actually worked really well for what we needed to do. So that was the plan that came out for us to channel and send back. That's number 5. Then we got a script. So all of this was done without really knowing what we were going to do. We knew that Hugh was going to sing an amount of songs and he was going to do an amount of chatting. But other than that, we didn't really know what to expect. Then we got a script, which I put in the Dropbox. It's unfeasibly confidential, so please don't share it. But it's you'll be able to see basically what the whole show was, and we then took that and started to queue it up based on the numbers that we knew that were in there. Could I talk about page 12, the design risk register? Yes, I can talk about page 12, which is in the channeling. Is it in the end of that package? I think you've gone ahead to a PDF that's ahead of time. We will get to it, Nicholas. So the next thing was the production desk layout, which I did, which is Patrick's big thing about when you're sitting in Wakefield for 3 weeks, as I said to Tim, it's so isolated because you're just a department on your own and you're not talking to video and you're not talking to sound other than shouting or on a Motorola. There is no other communication device. So you're quite isolated. And Patrick's tip very early on was that if you have a nice looking area in the rehearsal room, most of the creatives will want to come and sit with you, and therefore you don't have to go to them. So it's a great tip, but it works every time. So as a result, on the bottom of the Neg Earth spec is things like 4 leather chairs, 2 sofas, a fridge, a whiteboard, a rug, but which sounds hilarious, but we built a little still deck raised area in Wakefield. Video are sitting on their own, like 4 desks long, all on chairs on the floor, and we're on a slightly raised area, so you can see the floor, but also because it sort of creates this hub of creativity where everybody wants to come to. So in every break, he would come and sit on the sofa and talk to us about what the show is looking like and what we're going to do for the next number, and can you see some of the things that we've just done when he's been singing. That's only because it's a comfortable little nook in Wakefield that everybody wanted to be at. So it seemed really childish that I put my crappy sketch of a production desk layout in there, but I realized quite early on from Patrick that is the thing that you need in order to get everybody on side early doors. So then the final package comes out. This is the formal package from Woodruff Bassett. So this is the one that we went into rehearsals with. It changed obviously when we were there and we moved some things around, but this is their formal package. Again, this is quite confidential, but this is how Woodruff Bassett lay out every single show that they do. So it goes from a basic little who's who and a schedule to the same things we've just seen before, which is the spreadsheet of what it is. A slightly more broken down version of the spreadsheet on page 5, which tells you the different options for some of the lights if you were to have one with a custom lens, it would say so in there. And then any gobos. So we did a gobo load. That was Chris and I. I have spent 7 years working with Paul Lee Constable and John Clark, and rarely used a gobo until I worked with Patrick, because they just don't use them. So then having to do a gobo load for an arena show, I thought I have absolutely no idea what you might want, because I could probably put what I think might look good, but what is Patrick expecting to see? What's going to look good in the air? All of these things. And the phrase "what's going to look good in the air" is not something that Paulie has ever said. So it was a bit of a learning curve, which Chris helped me with quite a lot. That's fair to say. Then you can see a much nicer version of my production desk layout on the next page, and you can see the things that they've asked for, like a whiteboard, a sofa, a fridge, an A3 printer. Then the final version of the plan with channels that look nice, which is pretty close to what we started off with in the truss sketch that we did in Toronto, with, I think, the only difference being that we made the rear truss one rather than a straight one and a arched one. We just made one big arched one that was over the upstage walkway, which meant that we could top light him as he walked along the walkway. And then the floor package, and then the channels for the Roby LED beams, and then some pixel tape, and then the design risk register. So Nicholas, your question about the design risk register is a thing that all designers now, it's much more prevalent in the architectural world. Woodruff Bassett do a lot of architecture. So, which is why they started to put it in their documentation before, but well, I don't know any other UK designer that does this. But it's, in effect, it's a designer's risk assessment. So we all write on the edges of our plans that we are not held responsible for any of the lights that are drawn on this plan, which is all well and good. But if you haven't really thought about it, it's just a kind of get out of jail clause. So a design risk register is a slightly more show-specific risk assessment, only from the designer's point of view. It then has to go through an enormous amount of other people before it passes an actual risk assessment, not only the vendor, but also the production safety. There is a specific person who just does production safety. That's also true of big commercial musicals, but is especially true in an arena tour. And then it goes to the production manager to sign off. But this is the designer's version of a risk assessment. So it's things that are only relevant to this show. In answer to the question, what is a MIF for? It's a time code reader. So the show, thanks, Ben. We have them on our desks to show what time code we're at that point in the track, in whatever track is playing on stage. And by that, I mean almost all of the numbers for Hugh, I think all bar 3, we had a time code track to, which means that we had, in the sound department, there was a sound, for all intents and purposes, a sound number 1, who is the front of house mixer. Then there's a monitors engineer who just mixes in-ear monitors for Hugh, the MD, and for all the dancers, so they could hear just the track in their ear. They can also hear engineers talking to them if there's an issue. So there's a person dedicated to just doing that. There's another person who's called playback. And for Hugh, this was a guy called Mike, who's an American guy, who's one of the best playback engineers. And his job is there was an orchestra on stage and they played everything live. But obviously we have, like in a musical, you have an orchestra of, we had an orchestra of, I think, 8 or 10, I can't remember. Might even say so on this plan. No, I think it's about 10. And in a musical, you might have 14, 16, 20, but you still don't have the sound of 48 players. So you'll play a click track behind it, which is the same thing that you're hearing live, but with more instruments. And that plays in real time with the people playing live. So the MD hears a click in his ear, a literal click, and that means that he's keeping time with the recorded track that's playing over the top of them playing live. That happens in musicals, it happens everywhere. But anyway, that is with that click, you can also get a physical code. So it times from 0000 or whatever hour you start at, and it runs up, the clock runs up. And that means that you can start to cue the show to time rather than having a show caller say go, 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 whenever it might be. So this, Tim will talk about that in a lot more detail when he talks about 6, because from what I've seen of it, there's an enormous amount of time code in the show. But if you see a show where it looks very queuey, it probably means it's been on time. It's the show has been time coded, because it means that you can do stuff really quickly, and it's the same every night. So a MIF4 is a reader that we get in the front of the thing that has on it the playback, so we can see what code it's at, which is only as useful if you actually pay attention to it. Otherwise, it's just another thing on your desk to make it look like you know what you're talking about. In answer to your question, Ronan, about we're using X keys of some kind for hands-on control for you and Patrick, or maybe back out some kind of previous. So we had it was Chris using MA3. It was like one of the first MA3 outings, but we put it on HUGH. It was on MA2 software, but just an MA3 console. And I had an on PC Wing, which is a touchscreen that Chris has, that I always use when I'm working with Chris, that he set up to have all the buttons on it that I would sort of normally be pressing if I was on an EOS, which I know is a really stupid thing to do. But there's things, I think when I first did a show with Chris, which was like 2013, I said, oh, can we just go, can I just go into blind and just go into the next queue so I can see what's on in the next queue? And he said, that doesn't exist on an MA. And I said, oh, he said, that's like a lot of button presses for me to tell you that. And I said, right, okay, well, in an ideal world, I really just need to see what's on in the next queue. So he made a macro with loads of buttons that just look like buttons that I would use all the time. And that's a big touch screen. And that's the one that I had. Patrick has no screen. He hates them. So he has no idea what channels are on, what level are at, what queue we're in, whether the show is even on time code. But he just looks up and talks to us. So he'll sit next to me. He usually goes, the plan, let's look at the plan, see whether we actually obeyed it. The plan was Chris at the end, which is usually how it is. Yeah. Then me, then Patrick. Yeah, that sort of did work, because Patrick would go off and come back again, and I could just go and talk to Chris. But often Patrick would go and squeeze himself between me and Chris and try and give us notes in the middle of plotting. It's because he hasn't got a screen, so we can't write down what queue we're in, so he just says it out loud. So there, it answers your question. Yes, I have a touch screen rather than X keys. It does say X keys on this thing. I realize that, but that's because Chris has a set of X keys, I think, that he sometimes uses, but we didn't end up using those. We just used a big touch screen. Amy May, did you have a lot of meetings with the video team before the video? Well, we'll get onto the video because it's a funny story. So, in fact, let's go on the video now because it makes sense for the show notes before the show notes, which is after the final package, we then went into the theatre and, we went into a warehouse in Wakefield and we started to create the show. I arrived, I think I did a couple of visits while the show was loading in. It loaded in over about 5 or 6 days. And then I was there full time from week 2 of loading, which was like the last week of loading, and then into focus. And Chris was also there. Patrick wasn't going to join until what we would call cast on stage, and which is just HUGH. But he wanted us to start beforehand. So we arrived, which meant we could move fixtures around when they weren't in the right place. The things you would always do as an associate in a theatre as well, which is worth saying that is a massive, one of the biggest things that I do is that a designer has no desire to be in the theatre whilst people are putting lights up for how many hours a day for that many days until just twiddling their thumbs until the cast come on stage, because they've got much more important things to do, probably another show somewhere. So I would always go in and move things around that are slightly tricky, answer questions that the electricians have. If there's a slight conflict with sound, which there often is, work out what that might be and try and fix that. So I was there full time because it wasn't really you couldn't really pop to Wakefield. So from the second week of loading, and then from the week after, we then had, we started a couple of days of calibration for Zack Track, which was, yeah, as I say, I think they'd used it on Kaiser Chiefs, but other than that, this is the first major arena tour it had been on. So we were slight guinea pigs. And we started the show and we said, you have to sort of decide early on how many lights you want to calibrate into the system, because that's the bit that takes time. But because we didn't really know what we were going to use them for, we just did them all, which we then realized that is too many for the software at the time. We were trying to put too many universes through the system and had to put a hard line into the internet and get some very clever people in Vienna who made the software to upgrade it so we could put more universes of lights through the system. But we ended up putting every single light. I'm going to say every single light. We didn't put the wash lights because that's a stupid idea. We put every single profile through ZackTrack, which was an enormous. What was the universe limit count? No, a lot. I think it was. No, I would lie if I said what it is. The reason why we were pushing it is because we also put all the eye whites on the floor in them as well, because we used the bitmap editor in the MA so that when he walks down the catwalk, the tag would turn the lights on as he walked past it and then turn them off again as he carried on walking. So it was an awful lot of lights. Anyway, we then had a couple of days of calibration of that, which Jerome, who was our Neg-Earth brilliant engineer, did very judiciously. And we then we had a big broom that we put Hugh's face on, and we'd move it around the stage and be calibrating it to this, and then put the tags in the broom and be try and follow it around. Then we realized that the best thing to do is buy a remote control car, put the tags on a remote control, drive the remote control car around and try and mimic what Hugh might do and see if we can make the tags fail, whether it works, whether it doesn't work, how we need to finesse it. We could do a whole session on ZackTrack because it's intensely detailed. But needless to say, it requires a lot of calibration, which we did for a couple of days. And then we got on to queuing the show, which was, at that time, they were still, I think they maybe just began rehearsals in New York. But we had a script. We knew what the numbers were. We knew there was going to be talking between each number. So Chris and I started upon queuing the show. So I think we had a couple of phone calls with Patrick about what the general look of each number was going to be, and we thought we'd throw some things in. So we started to throw some timecode cues in for no other reason than that's quite a laborious task. So we sat with the tracks, the few tracks that we did have from the playback department, and started to listen to the tracks on the speaker. We had a cable that goes out of like a little portable speaker. And no, that's not true. It goes from the desk into a little portable speaker, so that you can, and then from your laptop into the speaker. So you can play audio track from the playback department. You can hear it, but also the timecode runs through the MA as if it is hearing it from the main timecode feed. We do that probably for the irritation of every other person in the warehouse for 6 days straight, listening to The Greatest Show, the number that's in that YouTube link. And it took us about something like 5 or 6 sessions to get that queued up, which is just hearing it and then hit and go, and then playing this back again and making sure the queue runs in time. So you can do timecode in various different ways. You can do it as learn by the operator hitting the go button whilst it's playing back, and the desk records it and then will remember it the next time it plays it back. Or you can go and manually do all the timecode points, which we had no desire to do. So we just did it live with Chris hitting go and then moving it one frame this way, one frame that way for a long time. So we did all that, and then Patrick arrived and we then proceeded to light the show. Now I realize it sounds like I've talked for like an hour about everything up until the point of lighting the show, and that's probably the most interesting bit about is lighting the show. But as an associate, your job is, and the company I've started since, is focusing on the enormous amount of work you have to do before the talent, the cast, walk into the theatre. And all of the various stages of that and the level of detail that you have to go into in each stage means that you'll get to that point without much stress, hopefully. If you are not as organised in those stages, it means that you go into it being an unorganised mess, and it inevitably means the show will not look as good. That's not meant to sound like it's crazy pressure. If you don't do the paperwork right, it's going to look crap, because that's not strictly true. But there's an enormous amount of work you have to do beforehand in order for the designer to feel that they can use all the tools that they have, and that is only possible if you've done your homework. So there's an enormous amount of work before we got to Wakefield. Then we got there, then we started lighting the show. So going back to Amy May, your question about the video team, the video was done by SU2C, who are a French Canadian company who I think if you look higher up the food chain are inevitably involved in Cirque in some way if they're French Canadian. And they were doing the video for the show because Hugh saw something they did and liked it. They were, let's put the nicer way to put it, not quite as organized as we were ahead of time. So they weren't entirely confident about what they were seeing on stage, and therefore their content, which I admit it's hard to make content when you don't know what you're making content for. But we did have a script ahead of time. Chris and I were queuing the numbers, so we did obviously knew something was going to happen. Their content was fairly woeful in how it represented what was happening on stage. So going back to what Tim and I were talking about at the beginning about Patrick being someone who gives notes to everybody, it very quickly became apparent that the video team had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And we decided that the best way to sort this out was, because Patrick has got a big eye for video, and also is the creative director of the Rolling Stones and looks after the video for them, and it's basically a very similar setup of 2 IMAX screens and a video wall. The only way, and the director was really nice, American theatre director called Warren Carlyle, really nice guy, but didn't feel confident enough dealing with Hugh and the orchestra and lighting and sound and giving some detailed notes to video. So we sort of all took it upon ourselves to send Patrick into that camp. So it meant that from that very detailed drawing of where Patrick's going to sit on the production desks went very quickly out the window, because he just ended up sitting next to the video team and sort of talking them through what it aesthetically needs to look like while Chris and I were putting the lighting together. And he'd occasionally turn around and say, I think we're going to do this with the video, can you just try and match it? Or he'd say to Chris and I, just put a blue one. No, not that one, another one, and another one, another one, another one, that one. And then you do come back to video and try and make them change their color to the one that we've just picked. So yes, it's fair to say, Amy, in answer to your question, we probably could have had more meetings beforehand, which may have resulted in this not happening. But we did have a weekly production meeting that they sort of occasionally turned up to and occasionally didn't. So, and I think I came to learn that the sort of creative meetings that we have in theatre beforehand about how you want, if it's a musical, how you're going to want a certain number to look, or how you want the general aesthetic of the show to look, is not something that they do in the rock and roll world really at all. And it does seem really archaic that they'll go and have, Patrick go and have dinner with the team at Stewfish, and they'll talk about 4 different shows and get them all designed that evening over one dinner. But the detail of, yeah, but hang on, if we're doing a gold leaf step and we're having gold glitter costumes, that needs to be the same, otherwise it's going to clash. That conversation doesn't happen. And that's also true of lighting and video. Let's not be, I can't tar everybody with the same brush. I'm sure Rob Sinclair would be like on the phone very quickly to say, no, I spend a lot of time, or Cassius or someone like that who do their lighting and the video. That they obviously have those conversations, but Patrick is quite opinionated about video, and has also a very, very good working relationship with Sam, who is a video designer that he works with a lot, that he did Elton John and does the Rolling Stones and lots and lots of other things. And Sam ended up making some of the content for Hugh in the end, because theirs just wasn't quite good enough. So it was quite a lot of, we'd have to come in early in the morning at 8 a.m. and watch the first cut from the video team that were trying to produce some content off-site for the numbers that we were about to look at that night, and it was a mess. Anyway, needless to say, Patrick spent most of his time floating between the video department and the director and the producers, and sort of trying to keep everyone happy, while Chris and I were beavering away in the background, making lights flash when the man said greatest show. So we then once we'd made a first version of the show, I suppose, we then went and did, I think, 3 or 4 dress rehearsals in Wakefield before we moved to Glasgow, and we had 2 or 3 dress rehearsals in Glasgow before we opened it. I put my show notes on it, which is probably absolutely not readable to anybody in any sense in any of the pages. But I know some of these things are like slightly interesting occasionally. And it was one of the few, I was looking on my iPad today and it was one of the few things that I had left. I tried to like clear out anything that is clearly not useful. But this is, to give you an idea, the reason it's so badly written is because when we watch any number back on a Patrick show, you'll be writing your own notes, and then you'll have Chris also might say, can you just remember 73 did a live move on that thing, because he's busy reprogramming something. So you'll be writing down a quick note from Chris. This is all as the associate. And then Patrick will chime in with his notes because he has no desire to pick up a pen and paper. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, because he's running around giving notes to everyone in like an excited school child. So he'll just quickly come back and say, during the Valjean moment, there was not enough lights on. And then that will be the end of the note, and then he'll run away. So it's sort of like a combination of my notes, a bit of Chris's notes, and lots of Patrick notes, all just thrown on a bit of iPad very quickly. And I don't even know at what point this is just as Notes Wednesday. I'm not as detailed as some people who write notes, what date they wrote their notes. Maybe I should. You'll see like the last page is 1316. That's Q 1316. There was an awful lot of Qs in the show by the end of the week. And then I thought this is more interesting to some than the others. It's not really in chronological order, but it's the Neg Earth version of Lightright that they give to their crew, which is not too dissimilar to what you'll see in the various additional resources folders of the Lightright examples you'll get from shows. But it's what Neg Earth send out, and you'll see there's a color code line at the right hand side, which is the flight case color that they go in, so that you know where it's going to go on the truck. And this basically tells them everything you need to know, everything they need to know when they're moving it between arenas. So then we opened it in, we'll get to your question. I'm not ignoring it. We then got to Glasgow, recalibrated Zach track, realized that the calibration thing is the bit that takes a lot of time, and it all sort of went very badly wrong in the first dress rehearsal, and it meant all the lights are flying around the arena and not on the man singing, whose name is on the poster. So, which you realize then you've got a lot of faith in technology and no backup. And luckily Patrick said, do we need to get rid of it? Do we need to get some follow spot operators? And I very confidently said, no, I think it's going to be okay. Let's just give Jerome another night to recalibrate it, and then let's see how it is tomorrow, and then we'll make a call on it tomorrow. He had a whole night to recalibrate it, and it worked perfectly then, and it did. I mean, aside from a few little quirks, it worked very well for the rest of the tour. So then we opened the show in Glasgow. We did some notes on the show in Glasgow. Patrick left on the day after opening night. I left 2 days later after doing a couple of more days of notes. And then that's where Patrick's connection with the show ended, in terms of, he was still credited as a lighting designer and would respond to emails, but he would consider that show done at that point. Whereas for the associate on that position, you're still responding to the electricians if they've got any things about saying, do you know what, all these wireless practicals, is there any way that do you think that we could use those film lights there was 5 film lights that we had, which were old film lights that we'd retrofitted an LED fixture in them, or wireless. And I think there was at one point that where they came down and they stayed on for the intermission or something like that, and they said, oh, is it possible that we don't do that, because then that means that we get an extra day of charging out of them, which means we don't have to bring them in every single night to charge whilst we're in the middle of doing a loadout to get to the next venue. So you as the associate are answering questions like that, as well as production sending you questions about 24 venues time where there's a massive obstruction in the way and you're going to have to move the truss slightly because there's a scoreboard in an arena in America that's right in the middle of your circular truss, and you've got to split it or move it, and you have to answer the aesthetic design questions about that. All the way through to about 2/3 of the way through the tour, we did Hollywood Bowl. We played Hollywood Bowl in LA, which was for those who know or don't know, it's an outdoor venue, and it's the only outdoor venue that Hugh played out the whole tour. And they just wanted to go there, which is fine. But the show was not lit to be outdoors; it was lit to be indoors. So I flew to LA and relit it. We had about 4 hours before the show. We relit it in 4 hours to be outdoors. Then we had the lighting director on the board that night whilst I was calling, because we couldn't use that track because it meant that the arena was too big. It was too much sunlight. The fixtures, half the fixtures weren't as they were part of Hollywood Bowl's fixture list, so it was just going to take too long. So we Zach tracked our fixtures and then we supplemented it with 3 or 4 additional follow spots. So I was calling follow spots for a show that never had any follow spots called the first time, whilst the lighting director was sitting on the desk altering things live from the 4 hours of previous programming. And then I got back on the plane the next morning and flew home. So the role of the associate doesn't finish when the show is opened, it's fair to say. And then the show after that it went to New Zealand, and they didn't have as many, we picked up a different neg rig. Well, the neg rig didn't go to New Zealand, so we had to pick up a different rig. And then half the fixtures they didn't have, so they had to substitute it. So we had to make a call about what the best fixture substitutions would be for a show that was only going to do 2 shows and couldn't cost a lot of money because it was only doing 2, but Hugh wanted to do New Zealand because he said that otherwise they'll feel left out because he's Australian and there's a lot of politics over there. So that's sort of where, and then if the show gets remounted again, which there's sort of talk that it might be, then that's when the associate might go back and do it without Patrick, or he might turn up for a day at the end to sort of sign it off and give all of his notes. But in general, if we're doing a remount, I would expect to do it on behalf of him. So Nina, your question, did you have a general idea of what those looks would be beforehand? Or did you first? Yes, no, we did have an idea of what the costumes were going to do. The costumes were designed by committee, I think it's fair to say. But because there's a big section in the show about Peter Allen, who is a very famous Australian act who Hugh has previously done a show on. And so those costumes existed. So we knew all of those costumes. We knew some of the new costumes. We didn't know any of the dancer costumes. And there were times when they'd turn up and everyone was wearing sort of like a grey onesie, thinking this is absolutely diabolical and doing nothing for the lighting. But luckily the director really got that and saw it. And so we had quite a lot of costume changes in every sense of the word during production in Wakefield, and things getting redesigned. But there's a number, he did 1 Million Dreams, and in that the whole number was signed, and I made a conscious effort early on that I thought the aesthetic for that would be that we should only light it with footlights and no one should be follow spotted, so everyone has the same level of light on them. And so, which we did, but it only worked because everyone was in white chiffon, sort of very floaty costumes. So it was a very cold white footlight and a very dark blue top light. And that was sort of it for the whole number. But that only worked because of the costumes. With that, we only knew that we could do that because the costumes existed. The costume designs existed when early on. So we sort of made that the look for that number is going to be, as Patrick would say, bluer footlights. What's a normal relight show move like? So that's okay. Well, for Hugh, the normal relight would be that they would turn up. The lighting director, who is employed by, in a very complicated way, employed by the lighting designer, but the lighting director would turn up and at about midday on a move day, maybe 11, and he would unpack the desk, plug the desk up. The techs don't do that. They would if you needed them to, but generally the lighting director would plug the desk up, rig check. They would have done a rig check from the dimmers before, but a proper desk rig check would have been done by them. Then he'd start the relight, which I think for Hugh, we tried to keep it as low as possible, but it was probably something like 220 positions to bang in. It wasn't horrendous. And there were some big looks and there were some that you could get away with. It was on the whole show was designed very early on, like lots of theatre tours are, and like lots of arena tours are, that it's on a truss point system. That means that the relationship between the light and the piece of floor is the same in every venue, irrespective of where you are, because it's your truss, your light, and your floor. Which means that when you turn up and do the relight, you turn the desk on, the light should point in exactly the same place. But doesn't matter if you're in a different city, because it's all worked out from a datum point, and the floor is laid to the datum, and the truss is laid to the datum, and the light hasn't come off of the truss. It's stayed on the truss and gone on the truck and come off and gone back in the air. So you turn it back on, it should be in the same place. So of those however many presets, 2/3 of them were overhead, ones that you didn't need to touch. There were all the floor package you'd need to touch, because the floor stuff sort of had to move around depending on entrances and exits in each venue. But actually, for that tour, it was a really easy relight. It was you had to. The biggest thing was the Zack track recalibration each day, each move, but the general overhead relight was pretty quick. And if we were playing 2 nights, Jason would do, who was the lighting director, Jason would do a couple of hours of it before the show, and then do quite a lot of stuff live, ready for the next night. Sam, did you check on the show from time to time? I did. I checked on it when it was in the UK. The producers would not have been keen on flying me to, however much I would have liked to somewhere exotic, Mexico, to go and watch it. But I think I saw it at Birmingham, and I think I saw it at the O2. Before it left, it did a stint in the UK, then it did a stint in Europe. Then it came back and did the O2, I think, for like a week or 10 days. And then it went out and did North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. So I checked on it in the UK, and then Patrick checked on it in the US once because he was close. And I then checked on it in LA. Sorry, yeah. So London, LA, and one other venue, and that was it. That's sort of, it's less than I would usually do on a musical. I'd probably check it if I wasn't going to each move to do the relight, it would probably be checked once every 3 months, just to make sure it looks like it should do. So it was less, which was, I think for the arena producers, they thought, why are you turning up? It's fine. We've got someone on the payroll whose entire role is to make sure it looks like it did when it left, which I sort of get. But in theatre, we'd still be keen to make sure that it did look how it did when it was left on press night. Jason, do you have any tips on how to scale up a show like this from small to bigger, and how you would work to replace fixtures but keep the look? Yeah, the replacing fixtures and keep the look, working backwards from your question, was hard, because the whole show, in fact, I've just remembered I didn't answer a question very early on from Alvin about how were the Camsons. The Camsons were excellent. There was an entire number, I think, that was done with the Camsons. I think that on the back truss there was, I don't know, like 40 of them or something like that. All of them tagged to Hugh on Zack track and a front light, and he was doing a tap number, and that was it. So just 40 backlights moving with him doing the tap number, and that was like, that got you like a minute of great stage time. But then to say, we're going to go to New Zealand and, can we use VO or 3500 because that's what we've got on the shelf? And you think, if you do that, that number is going to look crap. But also, more to the point, it takes an enormous amount of time to calibrate those Zack track fixtures, and it's done based on the motor speed of that light. So as soon as we change the light, it's not just that we're changing the output and the CRI and all of the rest of the color information about the light and the punch that it's going to create at wide zoom, but also it's going to really damage the programming that's been done with Zack track. So it was a huge task. It wasn't truthfully only answered by me. It was sort of in collaboration with Chris and Jerome, who's the technician, and we worked out what the best thing to do was, and the fixtures that were the closest motor speed to the ones we needed to replace. And we ended up replacing some, and I think that it ended up that we had a team in the UK doing a like for like bit of programming with one. I think it ended up actually that we just went to all Unicos. So I think they took a Camson and we took a Unico and tried to make it do the things that the Camsons were doing on the show, and then reprogram it for the Unico with Zack track in the UK, and then sent that show file out because they didn't have time to do it out there. But so I hope that answers your question. Harrison, how did you handle the transfer of Bat Out of Hell to North America, where you present once Craig took over the position. Harrison's very knowledgeable about the team that was on the show. The Bat Out of Hell, which is a slightly poisoned show for how many times it's not happened, is I did the first North American tour with Craig. For those who don't know, Harrison obviously does. Craig Stelzenmuller is an excellent US associate. As an assistant, now an associate. He was the associate on the show, and I was there, and I made it with him. Patrick wasn't there. He did come I think he came for a bit, but I think Patrick was in America doing something else. So it was just me and Craig and Tom Davis programming. And then I left, I think 3 days before press night, 3 or 4 days before press night, and it was just Tom and Craig and a local assistant calling follow spots. And then it did another stint in North America where it did City Centre, and Joel Shire did it. So it's been a bit of a bring and buy sale of US associates. Joel is another excellently well-established US associate. He did it just from paperwork. Neither Craig nor I could do it. So Joel just did that from paperwork. No, Joel Shire. I hope that's answered your question. I think that's everything about Hugh. I realise I just sort of talked for like an hour about, and I'm not entirely sure whether any of that was interesting or indeed relevant. But
that was fascinating, Rob. Especially hearing about going from theatre into rock and roll and arena touring and stuff. But also hearing about how things about that process are the same, right? Like solving problems, fleshing out the detail. And organizing a vision, right? All the other things, all the things about curating someone else's design.
Yeah, big time. I think it's because that I got slightly blindsided early on that it was such a massive show with so many lights, way more than you'd have on a theatre show, and the process was so different that I sort of forgot that you needed to be just as detailed as you are when we're doing a theatre show. And actually, it's just I'd still spend at least 10 hours a week on the phone to the manufacturers of whoever were building the set.
Yeah,
brilliant. And then Solartech to flash out all the detail that you would normally do as an associate on a theatre show. But I spent the first 3 weeks of this sort of just forgetting that I had to do that, and then realizing that there is no one else to do it. So
back
to me.
Listen, Rob, you're in a position as a big bad associate a lot now to hire an assistant. So, like, if you were going to hire an assistant for show X, what would you look for? What would they need to be good at, or what characterizes a good assistant?
Yeah, I think the best example is that when we did Bat Out of Hell the first time in Manchester, we had an intern from RADA there called Tom, who turned up on the first day, and he sort of sat down quite quietly, and obviously quite nervous, but really interested. And this was the first show this was the first version of the show, and so Chris and I were both new to working with Patrick. Tom was new to the world of being in a commercial theatre space, and it became apparent quite early on that Patrick doesn't have a desire to sit there and call channel numbers up and doing anything. So you're all sort of got to move on a desk. So it's like, okay, so like Patrick's literally not on the desk. So I'm sitting in his seat for all intents and purposes, which means that Chris has sort of got to take over doing the things that I might have done, doing work notes and bits like that. And that then became apparent that wasn't going to be possible because the show was so busy. So we started to use Tom, the intern, as like, can you just keep on top of the work notes? Then realized that we thought, actually, hang on, we're using this person as way more of an intern. And the production manager picked up on it. Simon Marlowe was doing it. He picked up on it very early on and said, this guy's not an intern, is he? He's like an assistant. I said, yeah. It's like day 4, and I could safely say he's going to be the assistant on the show. And he said, okay, well, let's just pay him as the assistant and then let's be done with it. And then he became the assistant on the show. And now it works for my company because it was like a relationship that started, I think because it was so many I was new to Patrick, he was new to us. We were like learning together. But in terms of his skills, about the reason why he was so excellent as an assistant is that he he did the things that needed doing without asking them to be done. So
Solve problems and solve them.
yeah, exactly. The thing that I did very early on when I was an assistant and when I was first an associate is if I heard Paulion Can say, wouldn't it be great if we just had like a shin in that bay and we could use that for that moment. And she'd just say it as like an off the cuff comment on cans. So I would then go to the electrician and say, can someone just get a hot lead, get a source 4, someone get ready to hold it in that bay or the floor in the next tea break, and we'll just see if she likes it. And then if she likes it, we can put it on the boom. And so she just said it as an off the cuff comment. Suddenly we get to the tea break and I say, oh, before you go for a cup of tea, just look at this. She goes, oh yeah, I love it. And then it gets rigged. And then by the time we're back in the session again, it's back on set. And you just have to use your initiative for like things like that. And Tom did that without asking. Patrick would say something wild about what we needed to do for the show. I'd translate that with Chris into what that actually meant. And then Tom would just go and do it. Or he'd do the work notes, and he struck up a relationship with electricians, which I think is really vital. The role between the associate, either the associate, if there's only an associate on the show, or the assistant, whoever's running the work notes, and the electricians is really important. If you have a bad relationship, then nothing will get done.
We'll get pissed off quite fast.
Exactly. Yeah. And so he struck up a good relationship with him early on, which I think was important. And also, he wasn't. And lots of people are going to say this, and it's really cheesy to say, not afraid to make a cup of tea. Like it's a weird thing to say, but it's important. And we realized, like, I think maybe day 6 or day 7, we realized that Patrick his notes are worse and more frenetic when he's hungry. So, which Chris and I realized quite early on. So we were like, I think when we gave Tom 20 quid and just said, can you just go to Sainsbury's and buy anything that will keep this man quiet so we can please carry on lighting the show? And so came back with this massive goodie bag, and we just like fling at him like he's a toddler, like just have a Mars bar and then be quiet for a bit. Right. But Tom, he'd go make a cup of tea, he'd go to the shop and buy things like that, he'd do the work notes, but also there'd be times when either Patrick or I would have to go out, like step outside and do something about another show quickly, a phone call, and Chris would need to work with someone to channel the pixel tape or work out some new channels for practicals. We made Tom early on. We made him like the head of new channeling because the show was a new musical that was having things added all of the time, and someone needed to keep on top of that spreadsheet because we were like running in excess of like 2,000 fixtures. Like if the electricians go, okay, that's great, you can have a new 5K. What channel is it? I've got no idea. Chris has got no idea. He's in the middle of plotting. So Tom did that. So little things like that sort of took the initiative. Is that it was a quality that was, like completely vital. And he would now say, I think it's fair to say, that we probably didn't shout him, because neither Chris or I shout, but we would be quite, if he'd do something that, like when people speak on the headset, when you're in the middle of trying to do something really important, that's one of the worst qualities of an assistant, is when people just speak at completely the wrong time, as I'm sure that you've found. Sometimes that we're all going out because the director's here and the designer's here, and they both have got conflicting ideas, and I've got to try and solve it. So now is not the time to ask whether Patrick wants to know a grey tea in the next tea break. But Tom learned quite quickly from Chris and I that like the etiquette, that sort of when to say things, when to not, when to give notes, when to not, which is hard because every design is different. And some designers really like it, some designers really sort of so about it.
Read the room, right?
Read the room. Yeah, actually, that's a really good phrase. Yeah, read the room, and especially a room full of politics.
Yeah, and egos. So, we'll have time for questions in a second, but I thought I'd just ask your opinion on one last thing. What if people want to be assistants? What tack do you suggest to them to approach designers and go about making themselves known as wanting to be assistants?
Yeah, I heard a couple of people this morning asking that. It's tough because I started when I was at drama school. I was one of my show roles when I was at drama school was the chief electrician for West Side Story, and it was being lit by Tim Lutkin at the time. And Tim at that time was sort of a new associate to Hugh, so it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
But that is the way that I got my first assistant role on the West End, assisting Hugh, was because I obviously did a relatively okay job at the show for Tim in a drama school when he was then doing a show in the West End, and he needed an assistant to cover him for a couple of days. So I came in and did it. So that's probably unfair as an example, because it's like right place, right time. But if you ask most people, it's right place, right time. No, like you said, no, people aren't putting this on the internet. People aren't saying need an assistant for this musical in the West End and putting it on the internet.
But I do think you can stack the cards in your favor, right? You can.
Oh, and you make your own luck. Like people that say it is all about luck, but you do make your own luck.
For sure.
I think that you, get yourself known, and that doesn't mean you have to go and be lighting 87 shows above a pub, although that's a route that some people take, and it's a perfectly acceptable one. I've got no problem with it. But you don't have to do that. You can make yourself known in other ways. You can make yourself known in the building as an electrician in the National, in the Barbican, and the Opera House, and so the designers will see you, get to know your face, get to know who you are.
Earn you some class.
Everyone's hearing later in the week, aren't they? Is it Dan and Sarah for the National?
Yeah, Dan and Sarah from the National. Talking about
that. So that's a great example of you could be, if you're a casual in the National and you slightly get spotted as someone or put an interest of being a programmer, and then you become a programmer, and then you could easily sidestep from being a programmer to being an associate or an assistant outside of the National. But get yourself known, whether that's just having a coffee with lots of designers or shadowing. There is something to be said about lots of people pick work up. Lots of people give work to people who they can see in the most physical sense. Everyone says that Luke Hall is the amazing video designer. Whoever programmed the Luke Hall show is whoever was programming the show when he got the gig, because the email comes in and says, "Would you like to do this tour?" And he looks to his left and sees that it's whoever it is programming it, Sam, and he says, "Do you want to do this show?" And suddenly Sam's got another gig. And that's only because the email came in when he was sitting next to him. But that's true of someone shadowing. If for example, you were shadowing a John Clark show, John, who probably doesn't get an associate much in his contracts, and someone shadowing sitting who'd really impressed him for the last 2 weeks sitting behind him, and he got a massive musical come in, it's not out of the question that you would be up in the running for the assistant. Yeah,
for sure. Stack the make your own luck. And listen, lighting designers are very easily flattered people. So if you email them and say, "I saw your show the other night. I really, really, really enjoyed what you did in this moment." Keep it short, but say, "Listen, next time you're in town and you're teching a show, I'd love to just come hang out with you and watch you." 9 times out of 10, if they're not too busy, they'll say yes. So
exactly, yeah.
Listen,
that's interesting. Bridget's just said about big spotted electrician, US versus the UK. About it, it's a different, which is probably true. The division,
and it's going to talk about that a little bit too, and about how the reason maybe why there is less of a standard associate assistant track in the UK is because in here you can be an electrician, and in the US you can't. In the US, the only way into the industry is as an assistant or an associate, more or less. We'll have time for more questions in a second. I'm just conscious that in 15 minutes you've got Ken Billington on the main stage, but so go pee. But also Rob will be here. I'll be here. Ask questions. Type them, or just turn your camera on and say hi. It's always good to meet people. And if not, we'll see you all on the main stage in 15 minutes, and maybe get the Dropbox open to the Ken Billington folder and have a quick look at what's in there before he talks. Cool. And thank you, Rob, from all of us here. And it was really informative and really interesting. So guys, punch in and ask Rob some questions.
So Charlie, is it acceptable to email them after graduation to see if they have any shows coming up they might need an assistant for? Yeah, I think you you could, absolutely. There's no harm. There's a difference between like emailing and badgering, I suppose. But if you're not going to, if you've shadowed them before, so you've got a relationship with them, so that when your name appears in their inbox, they're going to even vaguely recognize it. Then I think, yeah, absolutely more than acceptable to say that. Or even if it's just, oh, have you got, I see that you're doing this show. Is it possible if I can come and shadow you for a bit on that? If it's a show that's different to the one you did before, that's quite interesting, if they're now doing a piece of dance or they're now doing an opera, that, yeah, absolutely, it's acceptable to email, that's fine. What have you been doing with all your COVID free time? Well, yeah, it's a lot of it. Luckily, we've still got the company that I run with a video associate who does a very similar thing to what I do. We just do mostly all the prep work for a show up until the point of going into the theatre. We've got quite a few shows still needing to be prepped for next year. So we have still got some things to do, although much less. I've got significantly more time to do some gardening than I did before. But I've realised that I'm quite lucky in comparison to lots. We have only got big shows that are happening next year that we're prepping for, because the shows that can afford an entire company to do just the prep work are probably ones that are still in the timeline of running. And I realise that that's purely selfishly. That means that we're quite lucky we can continue working, and I know lots of people haven't. Yeah, previously very little free time, so it's been quite nice actually. Yeah, to be at home a bit more. And other questions. Would you say ZackTrack is your preferred moving light tracking system? Yes, we tested all of them before we used HUGH, and then we tested them all again before we put Mamma Mia. I say all. We tested ZackTrack, BlackTrack, and Follow Me or Spot Me, and ZackTrack was the one that we thought was the best, because we didn't think the joystick system was one. I still don't think the joystick system is one that's going to stick as an idea. I think it's a bit of a gimmick. No, I don't think it'll ever stick. The tagged system is clearly one that is going to take off. It's ZackTrack uses the same technology that they use when, if any of you watch like Match of the Day, and you see that they can see where the ball is, and they draw a line, see where who's it passed to, and at what speed. That's only because the same ZackTrack bought the technology from them. It's the same stuff. It's been going for a long time. It's very reliable. It requires a lot of patience, a lot of setup, but yes, it is my preferred one, and we have chosen to put it on. I was working on Back to the Future with Chris, and the ZackTrack is on that, again, for the same reason. We both like it. The name of my company, Lucy, is Ammonite, that I run with John Lyle, who I'm sure you know. How do you showcase the skills you have to an LD you want to work with them? Yeah, that's tough to... Philip, in answer to your question about skills as an associate or as an assistant, you could send them some plans. I think I did that quite early on. I sent Miriam, who worked for Patrick, who I knew from when I used to be a casual technician, like just after I left Billy Elliot, so 2011. That's 6 or 7 years before I'd even thought about that I was approached by Patrick to do anything. I sent her some plans that I'd drawn for HUGH, I think, at the time, and said, here's some plans I've drawn. If you need anyone to do any drafting, then do let us know. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it'd be weird if you suddenly sent them an entire LightWrite file and said, look how good my LightWrite file is. Do you think you need an associate? But drafting is, yeah, but like if there's someone that's a good drafter, everyone is looking for people that are good drafters, because there aren't many of them. So, but yes, you're right. It is easier to meet them and show skills later. It's quite hard. It's a bit of a weird relationship, isn't it? Because the designer then has to put their trust in you before they know whether you're good or not. But as I'm sure Tim will say, and lots of others will say, it's like 10% how good you are and 90% how nice you are. And there's a more eloquent way of putting it, I'm sure, than that. But you have to be the person in the room that everybody wants to be in the room, that people don't realize is in the room. So by that I mean you're not treading on people's toes, you're not taking the set designer out for dinner, but you are completely necessary as a cog in the process, and just as necessary as the programmer. And I mean that. It doesn't have to mean, you have to quantify that. I feel, but you have to be a nice person, and no one knows if you're a nice person until you work with them.
Yeah, you said earlier about like being part of the production desk and shadowing people. I work quite a lot as a production electrician. How do you take that step from just sitting behind someone and like being there to getting on to the next job with them? Is it just being nice and kind? And
yeah, I think I'm trying to think of an example because it's always better when you know. So I was a casual technician when I left Billy before I started being well, I wasn't really an associate full time until after Phantom. So it was about 2 months after I left Billy before I started Phantom, where I was just needed some cash. So I casualed at the Bush and casualed at the National and some places like that. And when I casualed at the Bush, Ollie Fennick was lighting a show there, and at the time I was the production electrician on the show. That the Bush didn't have much money. There was like 2 locals, and I was the one that was like allocated to that show. And it was quite complicated. There was a load of practicals, and so I think I ended up like producing a bit of paperwork that night on the train on the way home and giving it to him the next day and just saying like, here's all your channels for all those various practical things. And as the electrician, and then he said, oh, I've got a show that was at the Tricycle called Red Velvet, and it's just transferring to St. Anne's Warehouse in New York, and I can't do it. I know that you've got some experience of being an assistant or an associate, which I think he'd heard because Rick had emailed out after I finished Billy that I wanted to be an assistant. Strictly speaking, I didn't have any experience, but we will just brush that aside. Would you like to do it? And it wasn't until after, actually it was like the next May or something. So at that point I would have done Phantom. And he said, would you want to go and do it? And I said, yeah, okay, great. And I've done like 2 or 3 things with him since. It's not like I'm suddenly Ollie's go-to associate, but I've done a couple of things for him. And that's only because I was an electrician once for him. I think I met him for about 4 days, but on the 4th day I gave him a bit of paperwork with some channels on, and he obviously thought that was quite good. So, but I don't know. It's an example because it's a way of getting in, but it's not because it's not like a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
But I guess be proactive. If you're shadowing, especially if you're shadowing someone that's got an associate, you can see what they do. But that's a weird relationship, because what you don't want to do is suddenly be like, I think I'm better than them, here's some paperwork, because there's an entire person dedicated to doing that. But it's fair to say in the UK, as I'm sure you know, that associates are few and far between on shows. We just don't, they're very rarely the money for them. So if you're shadowing someone who hasn't got an associate and you go above and beyond your duty as an electrician, they're stick in their mind. So if they then need someone later, then you'll probably be the person they'll ask. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Have you worked in the music scene? Is there any way to get into working concerts with having to be a big name in theatre? Joshua, do you mean, is there any way of getting to working concerts without having to be a big name in theatre? Or with? Yes, so without. You can, yes, very different strands. Like there's a little limited crossover. Rob Sinclair is not lighting My Fair Lady at the Barbican, for example. Patrick is one of the few. I say one of the few. He's one of the people that do the crossover. Mark Henderson lit Kate Bush 2 years ago. Bruno lights Beyonce, and I can't think of many others. I'm sure someone will tell me there's more, but there is very few crossover. So it's different strands, and that's the best way. I'm certainly not an expert about how to go and work in concerts, but that you could, being a lighting director, if you wanted to be specifically lighting of concerts, Matt Dorr is an excellent example. Matt Dorr works for Bruno. It did originally associate for Bruno, which is then how that crossover started with Beyonce. If you were as a lighting director, you could step up to be a lighting director from the position of being an electrician, because everyone will get to know who you are. The lighting designer will see you on lots of different gigs. If you work at NEG, and you will get put on all the good shows because you're good at what you do, and the same designers see you a lot, and they need a lighting director, there's a good chance they'll ask you if they're impressed with you, and you show a genuine want to do the aesthetic side of it as well. But I don't think, like theatre, there is no hard and fast rule about how to get into working it. But I certainly wouldn't suggest that you try and become a big name in theatre and then cross over into working concerts. It's only very theatrical concert acts, or rather music artists that see the benefit of employing someone theatrical, that crossover exists. I hope that answers your question. How does your iPod play into your workflow? Are you using it to play your laptop on site? Interesting question. I tried to use it to erase my laptop and it didn't work. It's a replacement to pad and paper, for no other reason than to try and be vaguely more environmentally friendly. I used to go through at least 2 notebooks per show, 1 prep and 1 during. And if you like, and sometimes it's 20 shows a year, so it's like 40 notebooks a year, which seemed a colossal waste. So I tried to use an iPad, which also is the reason that it's stuck is because it's great for queuing. So for HUGH and for any musical that we do, I will notate the cues on the iPad, and then it syncs with a Dropbox every day to the DSM. So if we add anything, they can see it without us having to. It does slightly take out of the personal nature of walking up to the DSM and giving them a load of new cues, but often they're busy like trying to deal with something with one of the like plethora of other departments that they're dealing with. So I always sync up a Dropbox to my notated cue script so that it goes backwards and forwards to the DSMs, they can see it. And then I also run the work. If I'm on the show as an associate, I will run the work list from the iPad, and that syncs with all the electricians, so that as the note goes on, they all get the notification on their phone, and then they can see it, which means that you can get notes done without. It does sound like all I'm trying to do is stop talking to people, but it's not. It's just that it's way more efficient. You can write 10 notes down in a session, and by the time you're at the end of that session, they're all done. But you haven't seen an electrician the whole time. That's just because they've got the notification on their phone, they've gone and done it, they've ticked it off, it's done. So it's now an integral part of my workflow, but it doesn't replace my laptop because the Vectorworks capabilities of an iPad are still not up to it. How do you manage work on all different shows and all the different information coming in at the same time? Very good question, Paige. Yeah, it's quite. I used to, when I suppose going back to the notebook thing, I used to use a different notebook for every show, and then I used to just have, but that did mean at some point you were carrying like 6 notebooks in a bag on a train, which is the other reason why I went to an iPad, but the notebooks helped because it was the information for that show went into that notebook. And an iPad is just, you have to be very structured with folders. Now I just, I try to answer questions from people, whether that's an email or a phone call. A phone call, obviously, straight away. And I try to answer an email as quickly as I possibly can. A, because it's efficient. Why wouldn't you if you can? But also it means that you're not clogging up your inbox. If I don't, and lots of people like to spend their mornings, for example, as an associate, doing all the answers to all the various questions that have come in from the previous day, which is an absolutely fine way of working if that's what you want to do. But at like peak capacity as a company, we might have like 65 or 66 show reports coming in per day, and then there might be 7 or 8 shows in prep and maybe 2 or 3 shows in production at any one time. So there's probably like another 60 to 100 emails per day from electricians on various shows asking you questions about various things, or vendors, or designers, or sound engineers. So I try to answer them when they come in and get them straight back out again, so that it doesn't clog up, because it makes me nervous when my inbox number is like ludicrously high, because it feels like it's a task that can never be done. We're also very lucky that we have an assistant who comes and sort of filters out questions that they can answer before we see them. But that's quite a novelty, I realise. So in terms of starting as an assistant or as an associate, I think you have to be, I find that you have to be organised in your personal life, which means you can be organised in your professional life. If you see an associate and they've got a bag that's full of like things falling out of it, and they look like really scruffy and they're running a bit late, it probably means they're not all over their paperwork. That's quite a sweeping statement, I realise, but if you're organised in your personal life and you've worked out exactly how you're